Hello, I'm Wendy Wilson, and I'd like to welcome you to another edition of Realizing Potential. I am over the moon about today's guest. She and I have been in communication probably for less than about 2 or 3 months, but just immediately had great admiration and respect for what she does. She is a proud alum of Albany State University, but is just making a huge impact on a global level in the STEM field. And I'll let her tell a little bit more about that. But she is none other than the amazing, the great Dr. Melissa Davis. How are you today?
I'm doing wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Wilson, for having me.
Oh, it is my pleasure. I had an opportunity to see you on a local show here, probably, I guess it's been about 2 or 3 months ago. And a
Yeah,
mutual
yes,
friend of ours, Kimberly Carter, who also works here at Albany State University, she's like, you've got to
yes.
turn on dialogue. My friend is on. And I was hooked ever since. So tell the
Yes.
viewers a little bit about your background, what your, particularly your academic pursuits.
Okay.
You are, of course, a native Albanian, went to
Mhm.
Albany State. I'll let you go into that and then what you're currently doing.
Okay, wonderful. So, yes, I am a native of Albany. I went to Westover High School, and actually, Kim Carter and I grew up in the same neighborhood on the sort of south side of Albany, if you will. I decided to go to Albany State. I had several scholarships, but I decided to go to Albany State because number one, I wanted to go to a historically Black college. And then also, I'm from the South. My family is really close and I didn't really want to travel too far, too soon. So I wanted to stay under my mom's wing. Now, ironically, when I first started at Albany State, I was a pre-law major, and I decided that, I could do it, but it was not like very, I don't know, exciting, if you will. And so I decided to use my talents in science. My mom was a science teacher, and so she really influenced me to think, analytically about things. And I felt like, this is what I want to do. I want to, be able to figure things out. I like to solve puzzles. And then from there, I did a summer research opportunity program. At the time, Albany State was hosting minority students to go to these larger programs. It was funded through the National Institutes of Health. And I went to Ohio State for a summer. And that was my first sort of experience seeing real world research at, these large institutions that are, basically established to do research. And I was overwhelmed, and I thought, wow, you mean for a living, I could just work in a lab and discover things every day? And so, that was it. I was hooked. I did some experiments and I was the first one to my mentor at the time was like, you just discovered something that nobody else knows right now. Like just
Mm,
in this room know that this gene impacts spinal cord regeneration. And I was like,
wow.
wow, and that was so exhilarating, and I was like, I need more of this. I want to do more. And I must say that over the years, my purpose has changed. I think, initially the reason why I was interested in genetics was more about social justice. At the time when I was graduating from Albany State, there were new technologies where people were starting to attribute like genetics to behavioral, corollary. So, we found a gene for criminal behavior, such nonsense as that. And I, felt like, this could be really bad for the minority community if we don't really understand what they're talking about. You look at who's doing the research and in the context of not really understanding, the communities and the ethnicities that they're trying to describe. And I felt like, I felt a calling, like I need to be in the room, when they
Yes.
start making these interpretations. And so I ended up getting my doctorate at the University of Georgia. And from there, I went to postdoc at Yale School of Medicine and the University of Chicago. And at Chicago is where I started this health disparities focus, where, I did not know, like most of the community, that first of all, the African Americans were dying more of breast cancer, in that they were dying younger. and that there were different types of breast cancer.
Mm.
Kind that African American women were diagnosed with didn't have a special therapy. They call it targeted therapies, right? So, all of those things sort of contributing to the fact that we already had poor access to equitable health care kind of compounded, this disparity where we see African American women dying more frequently. And so that's been what I've dedicated my career to since then.
So I'm already grinning because we've got to do a part 2 and a part 3, and we've already when I shared the amazing work and who you are and that you're an alum of Albany State with our president. So the wheels in her brain started churning. So
Yes.
we already have connected you. So you're going to be serving on a committee or a board, if you will, with the CDC and Phoebe. And so
Yes.
that project is coming up to address
So
again.
excited.
Yes, we should be. Health disparities. She's like, put her on this and put her on this. And I was like, well, wait, I got some things I wanted to do too. But a couple things that I want to, before we delve more into your current body of work. I was born in the 60s. I got a birthday coming up soon, but I share that to say, I remember in high school that there was a book that came out, and I believe it was titled The Bell Curve. I don't know if you're familiar with that, and I may have the right title. So when you addressed or presented the social justice that we constantly are having to address, and I had no idea at that particular time of the focus of the bell curve, and I hope I have the title right. But this gentleman, and I use that word very carefully, had written this book, and this is a part of the history in terms of Black people being in this country. So since we arrived in Jamestown and trying to justify the peculiar institution of slavery as it is, but to justify his which so many people have done, and trying to explain why we treat a certain group of people a certain way. And so his thought process or rationale, or he tried to use science to say that there are mental capacity as people of African descent was far much less than those of European descent. So I don't know if you remember that book or not.
So I am aware of the book. I must say, I haven't read it through to completion.
Not necessary.
From what I've heard of the book, I try to time wisely.
Nonsensical. It made no sense. But again, it got a lot of leverage, and people again used to use that. So when you brought up the piece about the gene or some type of marker that then correlates to criminal behavior, I was not aware of that. I should say that I am not surprised, but again, that affirms why your work and why your presence, your representation is just so critical. And then why, and I'm going to get on the representation piece, why we need more Melissa Davises in the world. And so when we showcase you and your body of work and your brilliant mind, I could go on and on. Then again, and then that inspires others to then walk in that path. Yeah.
And I like the fact that you brought this up. Sometimes I feel a little anxious about talking about certain things that are sort of uncomfortable, but I think we need to have more uncomfortable conversations in order to get over some of the conflicts that we have, especially in our society today, some of the tensions. But, the bell curve was, basically sort of this, underlying theme of eugenics that, there were, certain attributes, if you will, that were socially ascribed. It was a construct of what one would have called intelligence based on some subjective definition of that, and trying to ascribe that people of certain ancestry just didn't have what it takes to do certain things, and it's absolute nonsense. And as a matter of fact, and I don't know if you're aware, but one of the Nobel laureates who discovered, or at least was credited with discovering the structure of DNA, he was actually in that camp of eugenics, Watson. And so, he made several statements around the latter part of his career that kind of made, a lot of the professional societies that had embraced him, they had to sort of, set him aside, if you will. And, it caused a lot of tension. And I think one of the things that scenario does, one of the things that's very unfortunate about sort of the response now that we have to have in order to mitigate against, that type of nonsense is, it's not genetics, it's racism, and so now
Indeed.
I kind of walk this tightrope of, well, it's a little bit of genetics, it's a lot of racism, and it's a combination of things. And I think, especially in the era of COVID, where, disparities was put on spotlight, this was something that was acute, and you definitely saw across the world that, no matter where we are, minorities are suffering more because of health inequities.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, you also reminded me, and I promise I'm going to stay on topic, but if you have not had the opportunity to read it yet, it is absolutely riveting. Isabel Wilkerson's Cast.
Okay.
And she talks about eugenics. She starts the conversation about that and how race is a deliberate construct to then again exacerbate this what we now see inequities and a shifting in thinking, and so many people are cemented to that thought process, and how it has been intentional and developed over years. And what was just absolutely staggering to me is how people who then want to push this whole race or false race superiority narrative have modeled their actions. And she talks about Nazi Germany. They modeled it after the South and racism and that construct here. Anyway, it is absolutely mind blowing. So you must pick it up. But thank you for bringing up that whole eugenics piece, because again, that is what underscores so many of the decisions. And again, what we're living through now, the disparities and the inequities, whether it be healthcare. You are going to be participating in a panel later in the month about the intersection of health disparities and food insecurities. So I'm really excited about that. But it's important that although these conversations are very difficult, that we absolutely must have them in order to begin to shift.
Absolutely.
So one of the things that I want us to not miss today is your body of work. And you, in terms of the impact that you've had on a global level. So you've done some work, you've bridged or shown some commonalities about, and you talked about ancestry, about genes that are commonly found in women of African descent. Let me start there, and which they trigger the breast cancer, the issue of, or the matter of breast cancer. So if you will elaborate on that.
Sure. So, as I said, when I was in my postdoc, that's sort of when I was introduced to the fact that, there are different types of breast cancer, and Black women tend to get the most aggressive form. And it's not just true in breast cancer, but it's true of just about every type of cancer, whether it's melanoma, lymphoma, prostate cancer, lung cancer, colorectal cancer. People of African descent tend to get the most aggressive form of the tumor. And by aggressive, I mean it shows up early. So usually, in no matter what cancer site we look at, African Americans tend to get earlier onset. And we can, and I'm going to put a pin in that and come back to it because of, a recent death that really, touched me, Chadwick Boseman. I want to come back to that. But
sure,
the gene that I study is actually from, it's called DARK. And there's a mutation that lended an immunity to malaria in sub-Saharan Africa. And so because of that immunity, and because of the fact that malaria was so rampant in that area, anyone who had the mutation had a better, survival advantage in that region because they were not getting malaria. And so then it basically, it became fixed in that population, meaning just about 100% of the people who lived in sub-Saharan Africa, on the west coast of sub-Saharan Africa, had this mutation or variant. I don't like to call it a mutation. But the variant then sort of got distributed along with the people of Africa during the transatlantic slave trade. And so we can see, like on a global level, if we look at the frequency of where this particular variant of the gene is, it tracks directly with, ports of call and where, Africans disembarked. Now, functionally, what the gene does is regulate inflammation. And so what's interesting about that is inflammation, systemic inflammation, is a part of the process of your body trying to fight off infections and cancer. And so regulating this process is very meticulous, if you will. And so having an entire systemic function removed in a different context can actually then become a detriment to your health. So then we see, alongside with, more aggressive cancers correlating with this mutation or this variant, some other, worse outcomes in things like asthma. You see more, it's actually related to obesity and inflammation related to obesity. It's related to diabetes. It's related to other autoimmune disorders that we see more prevalent in people of African descent. And so what I do is focus on breast cancer primarily, but we showed that this particular variant was associated with increased risk for this specific type of breast cancer. And so what's interesting about, sort of even the ability of me, my ability to do this research is that, everyone's heard of the BRCA gene.
Yes.
And, the BRCA gene was discovered because Marie Claire King and her group, much to their credit, I'm not trying to take anything away from them. I am actually a fan of hers, but, she was studying these large pedigrees of families. And that's in her time, when she was doing this work, that was the only way that you could actually identify, a genetic predisposition, was to actually watch the disease transmit through a family and then try to track, what's different about individuals in a family who have most of their genes are the same. Mm-hmm. Then there's something unique about the people in that family who had breast cancer. And so she was tracking through these very large families who had generations upon generations of health information. And that happened to be a Jewish population, white Jewish population. And so today, when you look at, the fact that when we look for BRCA mutations, primarily the main mutation that these tests will look for are the ones that are in white populations. And so when we give this same type of test to then African Americans, what we get back is information like, it's called variable of unknown significance, meaning we see a mutation in the gene, but we've never really seen it before. So we don't know yet whether or not, it's a risk allele or a risk variant. And so the work that we do with the International Center for Breast Cancer Subtypes is sort of leverage the playing field, right? Like I focus mainly on people of African descent, and I'm looking specifically in that population for variants that cause risk, not only for breast cancer overall, but for this particular type that's so bad. And then I wonder, because we see this in our African brothers as well, that they get very aggressive prostate cancer. I wonder, is this sort of a theme? Is what I'm seeing in breast cancer also applicable to all these other cancers?
Sure.
And so being here actually at Weill Cornell, I say, is the first opportunity that I've had to be in a very collaborative environment with a lot of allies, so to speak. And, everyone's been very welcoming of the theory and, supporting the research to, basically look and see, it's time that we reclaim diversity and ancestry as something beautiful and something we need to understand in the context of health, instead of sort of this opposite end of the spectrum. Like, the worst end of the spectrum is eugenics. The other end of the spectrum is nothing is different among us. And we're somewhere literally in the middle, not everything is dependent on genetics, but there's enough depending on genetics that we should be aware of what those things are. because my ideal is we will overcome racism. All of my people will have access to health care. And when you get here to get your treatment, I will have discovered something that's going to actually treat the disease that you have. Because coming back to Chadwick, I believe he probably had the best available therapy, and yet it did not work.
Right.
And, he progressed in the midst of treatment. And we see that it's not uncommon to see that in young people of African descent when they get cancer, that you can give them everything you have in your arsenal, but what they have is just different. It's just not going to respond to treatment.
Well, hats off. I'd be remiss if I did not thank your employer, Weill Cornell, for embracing and celebrating you, allowing you to just serve in an excellent manner. Again, because it's not always common, and I'm sure you've spoken to colleagues within your field who are not allowed that safe, free space. Absolutely. To conduct research, to apply what they've learned, or if it is, it's in a timeline. We don't have enough resources. I could go on and on. So yes. Very proud and honored to call that sister institution's name, what they're allowing you to do, and I hope it comes. We see what it continues to yield in terms of your work. I don't want to miss the other piece, because of course you are the expert in terms of, you have certainly identified there are some genetics that are tied to this as it relates to those individuals from African descent. Mm-hmm. And then that what we need to look at is then why is it so aggressive? By no means do I begin to even try to put myself in the lane of being an expert or extremely knowledgeable in terms of the other contributing factors. I can venture enough guess to say that I'm sure the environmental constructs, the social constructs, Absolutely. Help to exacerbate all of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, and we'd be remiss if we do not showcase that. So, as we'll talk about in a couple weeks, if you lack accessible health care, or whether it be health insurance, or whether it be there is just no medical facility or trained health clinicians in your area, that's one piece. Mm-hmm. And then just the everyday stressors. You may be unemployed, you may be underemployed. Albany, Southwest Georgia, unfortunately, is an area where there are significant food deserts that we have to contend with. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Housing insecurities. And the stress of that, impacts your health, which then exacerbates whatever underlying conditions you may have, and difficult to then address those.
I mean, when we look at what they call multivariate analyses, right? So when they try to combine all of the factors that feed into why there's a racial disparity, being Black is a health risk, just the fact that you are Black in America is a health risk. And for all the reasons you just said, because of marginalization, because we are not allowed to live in certain areas, because of policies that are put in place. I mean, even within the health system, for instance, your insurance company is not going to pay for you to have a screening done for breast cancer or colorectal cancer or prostate cancer before the quote designated time that, the powers that be say this is when you should start being screened for breast cancer. At age 40 something, at age 50 something is when you should be screened for whatever, colorectal cancer or prostate cancer. But as I just said, African Americans tend to get these diseases earlier. And so then we should start screening earlier, because the shows explicitly that the sooner it's diagnosed, the better your chances are for survival. And so that's, sort of an insidious, issue that, yes, you're right. There's just the systemic structure around minority populations that they have no power over really. And so it's up to us as a community to reclaim that power. And, people like me, epidemiologists, need to go back to these, professional organizations and make this point, that you need to change the guidelines, because we need to have the ability to go through these screening programs earlier in order to catch the cancer earlier. And I like what you said about food deserts as well. Here in Brooklyn, for instance, we do community outreach, and they call it a food swamp. And so it's sort of the same thing, but they're saying that they're sort of inundated and surrounded by poor food choices. They don't even think about the fact that, I'm surrounded by, fast foods and foods that are, bad for my health. And, 5 miles, and in New York, 5 miles is, pretty far away.
Right.
There's like a fresh food market, and we saw that in Chicago. And I think that was the first time I was even introduced to it, in Chicago, that people on the South Side literally had no access to fresh produce. And so they had to, eat canned foods, or, at best, maybe something frozen. And, all of that feeds into wellness, so yes, if you have to eat preservatives all the time, if you're eating fillers all the time, then absolutely that's going to give you a higher risk for cancer, diabetes, I think obesity, I think that for African Americans, this perfect storm. It's like, we, because of who we are, who our ancestors were, it's a completely different culture. A point when we go to Africa, the breads that they put out is freshly made every day, It's nothing that's been sitting on a shelf for weeks, like they don't do that. It's a completely different diet. So it's not necessarily the carbs, because they eat a lot of carbs, but it's the quality of the food, not just what you eat, but the quality of the food you eat.
So we've got so much more. Our usual time, Dr. Davis, is usually about 20 to 30 minutes, but this is such great information. So we're going to take a little break and then come back more, because I want our viewers to experience, what we produce so well here at Albany State University. So we'll take a break and we'll come right back.